I never imagined that a single phone call from a lawyer in Texas would turn my life completely upside down, but when Martin Pearson told me I'd just inherited 1,300 acres of prime hill country land from an uncle I'd only met twice, I thought I was dreaming. My name is Ryan Isaacs, and I'd been working as a civil engineer in Seattle for the past 8 years, living in a cramped apartment and barely making ends meet while drowning in student loans. Uncle Frederick had been my father's older brother, a man who'd made his fortune in the oil business back in the 70s and bought up massive tracts of land across Texas before retiring to his ranch. We'd met at my father's funeral and then once more at a family reunion where he'd mostly kept to himself, smoking cigars and telling stories about the old days. I knew he was wealthy, but I never expected to be in his will. "Mr. Isaacs, your uncle's estate is quite substantial," Martin explained over the phone, his voice carrying that particular drawl that only comes from years of practicing law in Austin. "The land sits in Kendall County, just outside Boerne. There's the main ranch house, several outbuildings, and the property extends across some of the most beautiful terrain in the hill country. However, there's something you need to understand about the situation." "What's that?" I asked, already mentally calculating whether I should sell it immediately or try to hold on to it. About 15 years ago, a development company purchased 100 acres on the eastern edge of your uncle's property. They built a planned community there called Vista Ridge Estates, 63 homes, all fairly upscale. The thing is, those homes sit on land that's technically still part of the larger property your uncle owned. The developer bought the right to build there, but your uncle retained ownership of the actual land underneath. They pay ground rent. I felt my pulse quicken. Ground rent? You mean like a lease? Exactly like a lease. The homeowners in Vista Ridge Estates pay ground rent to the landowner, which is now you. Your uncle set the rate at $50 per month per property when the development was built. That's $600 per year per home, which comes to about $37,000 annually from the entire development. The lease agreement allows for rent adjustments at the landowner's discretion with 90 days' notice. $50 a month seemed absurdly low, even to someone who didn't know much about real estate. That seems like a sweetheart deal for the homeowners. Your uncle was a generous man, and frankly, I don't think he needed the money. But the terms are clear, Mr. Isaacs. You have every legal right to adjust that ground rent to fair market value. I'd estimate that similar ground leases in the area run anywhere from $250 to $500 per month. We talked for another 30 minutes about the details of the estate, the property taxes I'd need to pay, and the logistics of taking ownership. Martin offered to handle everything remotely if I wanted, but I decided I needed to see this place for myself. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to San Antonio with a rental car reserved and a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety churning in my stomach. The drive from San Antonio to Boerne took about 40 minutes, and as I wound through the hill country roads, I understood why people fell in love with this part of Texas. Rolling hills covered in live oaks and cedar, limestone cliffs jutting out of the earth, and a sky so big and blue it seemed impossible. The ranch itself sat at the end of a long Kalish road, the main house a sprawling stone and timber structure that looked like something out of an architectural magazine. I spent the first day just walking the property, trying to wrap my head around the fact that all of this now belonged to me. On the second day, I decided to drive over to Vista Ridge Estates and see what I was dealing with. The development sat about 2 miles from the main ranch house, accessible by a paved county road. As I approached, I could see the entrance marked by a stone monument with brass lettering and 2 brick columns. The homes were nice, probably in the $400,000 to $600,000 range, with manicured lawns and 2-car garages. The streets wound through the development in a careful pattern designed to maximize the hill views while creating a sense of suburban uniformity. I parked near what looked like a community center and got out to stretch my legs. That's when I saw her for the first time. She came marching across the parking lot like a general inspecting troops, her highlighted blonde hair sprayed into perfect submission, wearing white capris and a turquoise top that probably cost more than my monthly rent back in Seattle. She was maybe 55, with that particular look of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of being in charge of things. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp. "This parking lot is for Vista Ridge residents only. Are you lost?" I turned and gave her what I hoped was a friendly smile. "No, madam. I'm actually the new owner of the property that Vista Ridge is built on. Just wanted to see the development." Her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like alarm. "You're Frederick Isaacs's nephew?" "That's right, Ryan Isaacs. I inherited the ranch a few weeks ago." She composed herself quickly, extending a hand with rings on 3 fingers. "I'm Pamela Richardson. I'm the president of the Vista Ridge Homeowners Association. We were very sorry to hear about your uncle's passing. He was always very reasonable to work with." The way she emphasized reasonable sent a little warning signal through my brain, but I shook her hand anyway. "Nice to meet you. I'm still getting familiar with everything, but I wanted to introduce myself to the community." "Well, that's very thoughtful," Pamela said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps you'd like to attend our next HOA meeting? It's this Thursday evening at 7. We could discuss the transition and answer any questions you might have." "That sounds great. I'll be there." She gave me directions to her house, where the meetings were apparently held, and we parted ways. As I drove back to the ranch, I couldn't shake the feeling that Pamela Richardson was already plotting something. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes you understand why people move to Texas. I showed up at Pamela's house at 10 to 7, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, carrying a folder with copies of the lease agreement Martin had sent me. The house was one of the larger ones in the development, with a stone facade and a 3-car garage. Inside, the living room had been arranged with folding chairs facing a small podium, and about 20 people were already seated or standing around talking. Pamela spotted me immediately and came over, her smile even more forced than it had been on Tuesday. "Ryan, so glad you could make it. Why don't you have a seat, and we'll get to your introduction after we handle our regular business." I sat in the back row and watched as the meeting got underway. Pamela ran the proceedings with iron-fisted efficiency that suggested she'd been doing this for years. There were discussions about pool maintenance, complaints about someone's fence being the wrong shade of white, and a heated debate about whether the community should invest in new holiday decorations. I started to zone out until I heard my name. "And now," Pamela said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "I'd like to introduce Ryan Isaacs. As some of you may have heard, Frederick Isaacs passed away recently, and Ryan has inherited the ranch property, including the land that Vista Ridge is built on. Ryan, would you like to come up and say a few words?" I made my way to the front, feeling everyone's eyes on me. "Thanks, Pamela. I'll keep this brief since I know you all have regular business to handle. As Pamela mentioned, I've inherited my uncle's property, and that includes the ground lease arrangement with Vista Ridge. I'm still getting up to speed on everything, but I wanted to introduce myself and let you know I'm looking forward to a good relationship with this community." A man in the 3rd row, probably in his 60s with a gray beard, raised his hand. "Are there going to be any changes to our lease terms?" I glanced at Pamela, who was watching me like a hawk. "I'm still reviewing everything with my attorney. If there are any changes, you'll receive proper notice according to the terms of the lease." "Your uncle kept our ground rent very reasonable," Pamela interjected, stepping closer to the podium. $50 a month is quite manageable for everyone here, and we've appreciated his understanding over the years." There it was again, that emphasis on reasonable and understanding, like she was already trying to lock me into some kind of promise. I kept my expression neutral. "Like I said, I'm still reviewing everything, but I appreciate everyone's time tonight." The meeting wrapped up about 30 minutes later, and several residents came up to introduce themselves. Most seemed pleasant enough, though I could tell they were all wondering the same thing. Was I going to raise their rent? I didn't give anyone a straight answer because, honestly, I hadn't decided yet. That night, back at the ranch, I sat at my uncle's old desk and really dug into the numbers. Martin had sent me comparable data for ground leases in similar developments across Texas. $50 a month was laughably low. The market rate was closer to $300 a month, and that was being conservative. My uncle had essentially been giving these people a 90% discount for 15 years. I thought about my situation. The property taxes on 1,300 acres were substantial. The ranch house needed repairs. I'd quit my job in Seattle to deal with the inheritance, which meant I needed income. And these were people who'd chosen to buy $500,000 homes in a nice development. They could afford to pay fair market value for the land beneath those homes. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed obvious. I wasn't trying to gouge anyone, I just wanted to bring the rent in line with what was fair. I called Martin the next morning. "I want to raise the ground rent," I told him. "What's the process?" "According to the lease terms, you need to provide 90 days written notice to each leaseholder. The notice needs to include the new rate and the effective date. After that, it's pretty straightforward." "What about pushback? Can they fight it?" "They can complain all they want, but the lease is clear. The landowner has discretion to adjust rent with proper notice. As long as you're not being discriminatory or violating any fair housing laws, you're within your rights." "What rate were you thinking?" I'd done the math a dozen times. $250 a month. That's still on the lower end of market rate, and it's a 5 times increase from what they're paying now. Martin was quiet for a moment. "That's going to cause some noise, Ryan. Are you prepared for that? They're paying $600 a year for land that's worth thousands. I'm not trying to be unreasonable, but I need this property to be financially sustainable." "All right, I'll draft the notices and get them sent out. The 90-day clock will start as soon as they're delivered." 2 weeks later, every household in Vista Ridge Estates received a certified letter informing them that their ground rent would increase from $50 per month to $250 per month effective in 90 days. I knew it was going to cause a stir, but I wasn't prepared for just how quickly things would escalate. The first call came from Pamela Richardson at 8 in the morning. 2 days after the letters went out, I was having coffee on the ranch house porch when my phone rang. "Ryan, this is Pamela Richardson. We need to talk immediately." "Good morning, Pamela. What can I do for you?" "What you can do is explain why you're trying to rob 63 families with this outrageous rent increase. $250 a month? That's unconscionable." I kept my voice calm. "It's actually below market rate for comparable ground leases in the area. My uncle was very generous, but that rate hasn't increased in 15 years. Your uncle understood that we're a community, not just sources of income. We have families here, retirees on fixed incomes. You can't just quintuple our costs overnight. I'm giving you 90 days notice, which is exactly what the lease requires. And it's not overnight, it's 3 months." "We're going to fight this," Pamela said, her voice tight. "The HOA board is meeting tonight, and we're going to explore every legal option available." "That's your right," I replied. "But the lease terms are clear. I've had my attorney review everything thoroughly." She hung up without saying goodbye. Over the next week, I received calls and emails from at least 30 different Vista Ridge residents. Some were polite, asking if we could negotiate. Others were angry, accusing me of being greedy or heartless. A few tried to appeal to my sympathy with stories about their financial situations. I listened to all of them, but I didn't budge. The new rate was fair, and I needed that income. Then things started getting weird. I drove into town one morning to get supplies and found that someone had posted flyers on telephone poles all along the main road through Beauern. The flyers had my name and photo, which they must have pulled from my LinkedIn profile, with text that read, "Greedy landlord gouging local families. Ryan Isaacs, no heart, no conscience." My phone number was printed at the bottom with an invitation for people to let him know what you think. My phone started ringing constantly with calls from strangers, most of them calling me names or making vague threats. I had to change my number and make it unlisted. When I complained to the sheriff's department, they said unless I could prove who made the flyers, there wasn't much they could do about it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks after the notices went out, and Pamela made sure I knew I was expected to attend. I showed up with Martin, who'd driven up from Austin to provide legal support if needed. The community center was packed, probably 100 people crammed into a space meant for 50. Someone had even invited local press. I recognized a reporter from the Beauern Star standing in the back with a camera. Pamela called the meeting to order and immediately launched into what could only be described as a prepared speech about my a soul on the Vista Ridge community. She talked about how my uncle had been a pillar of fairness and how I was betraying his legacy. She presented a petition signed by all 63 households demanding that I rescind the rent increase. She even had a lawyer there, a guy named Dennis Crawford who practiced real estate law in San Antonio. When she finally let me speak, I walked to the front with Martin beside me. I understand this increase is difficult for people to accept, I began. But the fact is that $50 a month was never a sustainable rate. My uncle could afford to subsidize this community because he had other income sources. I don't have that luxury. The property taxes on 1,300 acres are over $70,000 a year. The ranch needs maintenance. This isn't about greed. It's about basic financial reality. "You're charging us $3,000 a year per household," someone shouted from the audience. "That's highway robbery. That's $250 a month for the land your $600,000 home sits on," I countered. "If you owned the land outright, you'd be paying property taxes on it. As it is, the ground rent is still cheaper than what ownership would cost you." Dennis Crawford stood up. "Mr. Isaacs, we've reviewed the lease agreement, and we believe there are grounds to challenge this increase. The language about landowner discretion is vague enough that a court might find it unconscionable to impose such a dramatic increase without some form of negotiation or graduated implementation." Martin spoke up for the first time. "The lease language has been standard for ground rent agreements in Texas for decades. Mr. Isaacs has provided more than adequate notice, and the rate he's charging is demonstrably below market value. Any legal challenge would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful." The meeting devolved into shouting after that. People were angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame. I was the easy target. We left after about an hour, and as we walked to our cars, someone threw an egg that splattered across Martin's windshield. "Welcome to small-town Texas," Martin said dryly, wiping at the mess with a napkin. Over the next month, the situation continued to escalate. The HOA board hired Dennis Crawford to file a lawsuit against me, claiming breach of contract and unconscionable business practices. Martin assured me it was a nuisance suit that wouldn't go anywhere, but it still meant legal fees and time spent dealing with depositions and discovery. Meanwhile, Pamela Richardson seemed to make harassing me her full-time job. She filed complaints with the county about made-up zoning violations on my property. She organized a protest where about 40 residents stood at the entrance to Vista Ridge, with signs calling me a swindler and a crook. She even tried to get the local paper to run an investigative piece about predatory landowners, though the editor apparently decided it wasn't newsworthy enough. What really surprised me was how creative some of the residents got in trying to avoid paying the increased rent. When the 90-day notice period expired and the new rate went into effect, I started getting payments that were clearly designed to cause problems. One person sent 63 checks for $1 each. Another sent payment in the form of a money order made out to Ryan Isaacs, greedy bastard. Several people just stopped paying altogether. Martin advised me to document everything and be prepared to start eviction proceedings if necessary. "Ground lease evictions are complicated," he warned. "Because these people own the structures on the land, you can't just kick them out. But you can put liens on their properties and eventually force sales to recover unpaid rent. It's not pretty, but it's effective. I didn't want it to come to that." Despite what Pamela and her supporters thought, I wasn't some cartoon villain who enjoyed making people miserable. I just needed the property to pay for itself. But about half the residents were refusing to pay the new rate, which meant I was facing a significant shortfall in expected income. That's when I discovered something interesting. While going through my uncle's files in more detail, I found correspondence between him and the original developer of Vista Ridge Estates. In those letters, my uncle had mentioned that the ground rent low because the developer had agreed to certain conditions about maintaining the community and respecting the surrounding ranch land. There were specific promises about noise control, light pollution, and restricting access to certain trails that bordered both properties. Out of curiosity, I drove around Vista Ridge and the surrounding area to see if those conditions were being maintained. They weren't. Several homes had installed floodlights that blazed all night, violating the dark sky provisions my uncle had requested. There was a trail that was supposed to be kept clear for ranch access, but someone had built a fence across it. Most significantly, the community center had been expanded with a large outdoor pavilion that was used for parties and events, often with loud music that carried across the property until late at night. I called Martin and told him what I'd found. "Can we use this?" "Absolutely. If the residents breached the conditions your uncle set for the favorable lease rate, that strengthens your position considerably. It shows that the low rent was conditional, not guaranteed in perpetuity. I'll amend our response to their lawsuit to include this information." The legal battle dragged on through the summer. Dennis Crawford filed motion after motion, clearly hoping to bleed me dry with legal fees or force me into a settlement. But Martin was good at his job, and every motion was denied or dismissed. In August, we finally got our day in court for a hearing on the HOA's request for an injunction against the rent increase. Judge Patricia Hammond presided over the hearing in Kendall County Courthouse in Bourne. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years. Both sides presented their arguments, and I sat at the plaintiff's table watching Pamela Richardson glare at me from the gallery. Dennis Crawford argued that the rent increase was unconscionable and violated the spirit of the original agreement. He presented testimony from residents about their financial hardships and characterized me as an outsider who didn't understand or care about the community. Martin countered with market comparisons, the clear language of the lease agreement, and evidence that the residents had breached the conditions my uncle had set for the favorable rate. He also pointed out that many of the Vista Ridge homeowners had significantly increased the value of their properties through renovations and improvements, suggesting they weren't as financially strapped as they claimed. Judge Hammond took 2 weeks to issue her ruling. When it came, it was decisive and unambiguous. The lease agreement was valid, the rent increase was within my rights as landowner, and the HOA's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. She also ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees, which had mounted to over $40,000 by that point. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The day after the ruling, I was working on some repairs to one of the ranch outbuildings when I noticed smoke in the distance. At first, I thought it was just someone burning brush, which was common in the area. But the smoke kept getting thicker and darker, and I realized it was coming from the direction of Vista Ridge. I jumped in my truck and drove toward the development, my heart pounding. As I got closer, I could see flames shooting up from the community center. Fire trucks from Bourne and several neighboring communities were already there, along with sheriff's deputies and what looked like half the residents of Vista Ridge. I parked and walked as close as the deputies would let me get. The community center was fully engulfed, flames consuming the structure while firefighters poured water on it and the surrounding buildings to prevent the fire from spreading. It took them 3 hours to get it under control, and by then there was nothing left but a smoking shell. A deputy named Carson approached me as I stood watching. "You're Ryan Isaacs, right? The landowner?" "That's right. What happened?" "Fire chief thinks it was arson. They found evidence of accelerants in multiple locations. This was deliberately set." He paused, studying my face. "Where were you this afternoon between 2 and 4? I felt my stomach drop. "At the ranch, I was working on one of the outbuildings by myself." "Anyone who can verify that?" "No, I live alone out there." Deputy Carson nodded slowly. "Well, don't leave town. I'm sure investigators are going to want to talk to you." I spent the next 2 days in a state of anxiety, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The fire investigators did interview me, asking detailed questions about my whereabouts and my relationship with the Vista Ridge community. I told them the truth, that I'd been at the ranch and had nothing to do with the fire. They seemed skeptical, probably because half the residents of Vista Ridge were telling anyone who'd listen that I must have burned down the community center out of spite. The break in the case came 3 days later. Fire investigators found security camera footage from a home across the street from the community center that showed 2 people approaching the building shortly before the fire started. The video quality wasn't great, but it was good enough to identify them: Pamela Richardson and a man named Todd Hendricks, who served as treasurer on the HOA board. The arrests happened quickly after that. Pamela and Todd were charged with first-degree arson, a felony that carried a potential sentence of 5 to 99 years in Texas. The investigation revealed that they'd planned the fire as a way to frame me and turn public opinion even more strongly against me. They'd hoped that if I was arrested for arson, the ground lease would become void, or I'd be forced to sell the property at a discount. The whole thing was incredibly stupid and short-sighted, but I guess that's what desperation does to people. Pamela had been so focused on fighting the rent increase that she'd convinced herself any action was justified. The fallout from the arrests was immediate and severe. The remaining HOA board members resigned en masse. Several Vista Ridge residents reached out to me with apologies, saying they'd never supported Pamela's more extreme tactics and were horrified by what she'd done. The local press covered the story extensively, and suddenly I was no longer the villain of the narrative. With Pamela and Todd facing serious criminal charges, the opposition to the rent increase collapsed. Most residents started paying the new rate without further complaint. Those who'd been holding out quickly got in line once it became clear that I could and would pursue legal remedies for non-payment. I worked with the remaining residents to establish a new HOA board, one that was actually interested in working collaboratively rather than fighting me at every turn. We set up a proper system for rent collection and communication. I even agreed to some compromises, like guaranteeing that the rent wouldn't increase more than 3% annually for the next 10 years, giving residents some predictability in their costs. The community center was eventually rebuilt, funded by insurance and a settlement with Pamela's and Todd's homeowners insurance policies. The new structure was actually nicer than the old one, with better facilities and proper sound insulation to address the noise issues. As for Pamela and Todd, they both eventually took plea deals. Pamela got 6 years in state prison, while Todd got 4. They were also ordered to pay restitution for the damage to the community center and the costs of the investigation. I heard through the grapevine that Pamela's husband divorced her and moved back to Dallas, and their house in Vista Ridge was sold at a significant loss. I decided to keep the ranch rather than sell it. With the ground rent income now at market rate, the property was financially sustainable. I hired a property manager to handle the day-to-day interactions with Vista Ridge residents, which gave me some distance from the drama. I also started raising cattle on some of the acreage, which turned out to be both profitable and surprisingly satisfying. One afternoon in late September, about 6 months after the fire, I was riding my horse along the ridge that overlooked Vista Ridge Estates. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of orange and gold, and I could see the lights starting to come on in the houses below. It looked peaceful, like the kind of place people dreamed about when they thought of hill country living. My phone rang. It was Martin. "Hey Ryan, just wanted to give you an update. The last of the outstanding legal issues got resolved today. You're officially clear of everything related to the HOA lawsuit and the criminal investigation." "That's great news," I said, meaning it. "How are things going out there? Still planning to stay?" I looked out across the property, 1,300 acres of Texas hill country that now felt like home in a way Seattle never had. "Yeah, I'm staying. This is where I'm supposed to be." "Your uncle would be proud," Martin said. "You handled a difficult situation with integrity. Not everyone would have." After we hung up, I sat there for a while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky. The whole experience had been more complicated and stressful than anything I'd dealt with before. I'd been called names, sued, accused of arson, and made into a local villain. But I'd also learned something about standing my ground and not letting people take advantage of me just because it was easier to give in. The ground rent was fair, the residents could afford it, and the property could now sustain itself for generations, which is probably what Uncle Frederick had wanted all along. He'd kept the rent low because he could, not because he should have. Sometimes being generous means leaving things in a position where they can succeed without you, not just making life easy in the moment. I rode back to the ranch house as full darkness settled over the hills. Tomorrow I'd check on the cattle, meet with the property manager about some maintenance issues, and probably deal with a dozen other small problems that came with owning so much land. But tonight, I was just going to enjoy the quiet and the stars, and the knowledge that I'd made it through something hard and come out better on the Vista Ridge Estates continued to thrive under its new leadership. The residents, who'd been reasonable throughout the conflict, became community leaders, working to rebuild the neighborhood's reputation and relationship with me as their landlord. We established a quarterly meeting schedule where I'd update them on ranch operations and they'd update me on community issues. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional and respectful. I even became friendly with some of the residents. There was a couple in their 70s, Robert and Margaret Chen, who'd moved to Vista Ridge after Robert retired from a career as a petroleum engineer in Houston. They'd been among the first to reach out after Pamela's arrest, apologizing for not speaking up sooner against her increasingly erratic behavior. We just wanted a quiet place to enjoy our retirement. Margaret told me one day when I stopped by their house to discuss a drainage issue affecting several properties. Pamela made everything so much more complicated than it needed to be. She took the HOA presidency and turned it into her personal fiefdom. How did she even get that much power? I asked. Robert shook his head. She volunteered for everything, and most people were happy to let her handle things. By the time anyone realized she was making unilateral decisions without proper board approval, she'd consolidated enough support among a vocal minority that it was hard to challenge her. Classic case of how HOAs can go wrong when good people don't pay attention. That conversation stuck with me. It wasn't really about the money, I realized. Pamela had felt powerful as HOA president, and my rent increase threatened that power. If she couldn't control me, she couldn't control the narrative about what was happening in her community. The fire had been her last desperate attempt to regain that control. The legal system worked its way through the criminal proceedings over the following year. I had to testify at both Pamela's and Todd's trials, recounting the timeline of events and the escalating harassment. It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before convicting both of them on all charges. At sentencing, Pamela tried to give a statement about how she'd only been trying to protect her community, but Judge Hammond cut her off. "Mrs. Richardson, you committed a serious felony that endangered lives and destroyed property. Your motivations, whatever they might have been, don't excuse arson. The court finds that a sentence of 6 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, with credit for time served, is appropriate." Todd got 4 years, primarily because he'd cooperated more fully with investigators and seemed genuinely remorseful. Pamela never showed any real regret, maintaining until the end that she'd been justified in her actions. With the criminal cases resolved, I finally felt like I could move forward without looking over my shoulder. The ranch became my full-time focus, and I discovered I had a real aptitude for land management. I took some courses at Texas A&M on sustainable ranching practices and started implementing rotational grazing systems that improved the health of the pastures. The cattle operation grew slowly but steadily, and I even started breeding a few horses on the side. The ground rent income provided a stable financial foundation that allowed me to invest in improvements to the property. I renovated the main house, updating the plumbing and electrical systems while preserving its historic character. I built a new barn with modern facilities for the livestock. I hired a couple of ranch hands to help with the daily work, which created jobs in the local community and helped change the perception of me from outsider exploiting locals to member of the community, creating opportunities. One of the ranch hands I hired was a young guy named Miguel Torres, whose family had lived in Kendall County for generations. He knew the land and the livestock business inside and out, and he had a work ethic that put me to shame. We developed a good working relationship, and he eventually became my ranch foreman, managing the day-to-day operations while I handled the business and financial side of things. "You know, boss," Miguel said one day as we were repairing a section of fence, "people in town talk about you differently now. Used to be you were that guy from Seattle who jacked up everyone's rent. Now you're just Ryan, the guy who runs the Ezek's ranch and minds his own business." "That's all I ever wanted to be," I replied, stretching wire across a post. "Yeah, well, Pamela Richardson made that impossible for a while. She was always stirring things up, even before you got here. My cousin lived in Vista Ridge for a couple years, and he said the HOA was constantly harassing people over stupid stuff. Like, she actually fined someone $300 because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black." I'd heard similar stories from other residents. Pamela's obsession with control had extended to every aspect of Vista Ridge life, creating an atmosphere where people were afraid to plant the wrong flowers or paint their shutters the wrong color. With her gone, the new HOA board had relaxed many of the more ridiculous rules, and the community seemed happier for it. The experience taught me some valuable lessons about property ownership, community dynamics, and standing up for what's fair, even when it's unpopular. I'd gone into the situation thinking I was just bringing rent in line with market rates, not realizing I was challenging a power structure that someone had built their entire identity around. Pamela hadn't just been fighting the rent increase, she'd been fighting to maintain her relevance and authority. 2 years after I'd inherited the ranch, I was invited to speak at a property rights conference in Austin. Martin had suggested me as a speaker, and the organizers thought my story would be interesting to other landowners dealing with similar issues. I was nervous about public speaking, but I agreed to do it. The conference was held at a hotel near the state capitol, and there were probably 300 people in attendance when I gave my presentation. I talked about the legal framework for ground leases, the importance of understanding your rights as a property owner, and the challenges of dealing with organized opposition from tenant groups. I also talked about the importance of being fair and reasonable, noting that while I'd insisted on market rate rent, I'd also committed to predictable increases and open communication with the residents. After the presentation, several people came up to ask questions or share their own experiences. One woman told me about a similar situation she was facing with a mobile home park where the tenants were threatening to sue if she raised rent at all, even though the rates hadn't changed in 12 years. A man described a commercial property where the ground lease tenants were trying to claim adverse possession because the previous owner hadn't enforced certain terms of the lease. I realized that what I'd gone through with Vista Ridge Estates wasn't unique. All over Texas and beyond, property owners were struggling to balance their financial needs with tenant expectations and legal complexities. Some handled it well, others didn't. The common thread was that communication and clear legal documentation were essential. Martin attended my presentation and congratulated me afterward. "You've come a long way from that nervous guy who called me 2 years ago asking what ground rent even meant." "I've had a good teacher," I said, "and a lot of expensive on-the-job training. That lawsuit probably cost you $50,000 when all was said and done, but you stood your ground and won. That matters." "Did the HOA ever pay those legal fees the judge ordered?" "Most of it. We had to put liens on some properties to collect, but we got about $35,000 of the $40 they owed." "Close enough." We grabbed dinner that night at a barbecue place downtown, and Martin filled me in on some of the legal developments in property law that might affect the ranch. Texas was considering some new legislation around ground leases that would require additional disclosure to potential buyers, which seemed reasonable. There was also talk of regulations around HOA powers, limiting their ability to levy fines without proper notice and appeals processes. Honestly, what happened with Pamela Richardson might end up changing some laws, Martin said, pulling apart a beef rib. "When an HOA president commits arson to try to frame a landowner, that suggests the system has some serious flaws. You think she was that unusual?" "The arson part, yes. But the power-hungry HOA president who makes life miserable for everyone, that's not unusual at all. There are thousands of Pamelas out there running their little fiefdoms and terrorizing homeowners over fence heights and grass length. Most of them don't cross the line into felony territory, but they make people miserable in countless small ways." I thought about that as I drove back to the ranch that night. Pamela had taken something that should have been straightforward, a business relationship between a landowner and tenants, and turned it into a personal war. She'd mobilized a community based on fear and resentment, convinced people that I was their enemy rather than just someone trying to run a sustainable business. And when legal methods didn't work, she'd literally tried to burn it all down. The scary part was how close she'd come to succeeding. If that security camera hadn't caught her and Todd on video, I might very well have been arrested for arson. The evidence against me would have been circumstantial but compelling. I had motive, opportunity, and a well-documented conflict with the community. Even if I'd been acquitted eventually, the legal fees and damage to my reputation could have been devastating. Back at the ranch, I poured myself a bourbon and sat on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the hill country. Cattle lowing in the distance, crickets chirping, the occasional call of a coyote. This was home now in a way that surprised me. I'd never imagined myself as a rancher or a landowner. My life had been on a completely different trajectory before Uncle Frederick's death changed everything. I wondered sometimes what he'd think about how everything had played out. Had he known that his low rent would create problems down the line? Had he simply not cared because the money didn't matter to him? Or had he trusted that whoever inherited the ranch would do what was necessary, even if it wasn't popular? I'd never know the answers to those questions, but I hoped he'd approve of how I'd handled things. I'd been fair. I'd followed the law. I'd stood up to intimidation and harassment. And when Pamela Richardson had tried to destroy everything, I'd cooperated with law enforcement and let the justice system work. The years that followed were quieter, thankfully. The cattle operation continued to grow, and I expanded into some agritourism activities, offering hunting leases and photography tours on parts of the property. The ground rent from Vista Ridge remained stable and predictable, with most residents paying on time and without complaint. The new HOA board was professional and easy to work with, addressing issues promptly and keeping me informed of community developments. I even started dating someone, a veterinarian named Elena Dawson, who I met when she came out to the ranch to treat one of my horses for colic. She was smart, funny, and completely unimpressed by the whole HOA drama, which I found refreshing. Most people in the area knew the story and had opinions about it, but Elena just saw it as something that had happened and was now over. "You did what you had to do," she said when I told her the full story on our third date. "People can't expect you to subsidize their lifestyle indefinitely. That's not how business works." "You'd be surprised how many people think exactly that," I replied. "Oh, I wouldn't. I run a business too. You know how many clients expect me to provide services for free or at cost because they can't afford full price? If I said yes to all of them, I'd be bankrupt in a month. Being compassionate doesn't mean being a doormat." That was something I'd learned the hard way. Compassion and fairness aren't the same as letting people take advantage of you. I could acknowledge that the rent increase was difficult for some Vista Ridge residents while still maintaining that it was necessary and appropriate. Both things could be true at the same time. 3 years after the fire, I was invited to another HOA meeting at Vista Ridge. This time, it was a celebration rather than a confrontation. The community center had been fully rebuilt, and they were holding a grand opening ceremony. I almost didn't go, worried that my presence might bring up bad memories or create tension. But the new HOA president, a woman named Susan Martinez, personally called to insist that I attend. "Ryan, you're part of this community whether you live within Vista Ridge or not. We want you there. We need to show that we've moved past all the ugliness and become something better." So I went, bringing Elena with me for moral support. The new community center was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the hills, a full commercial kitchen, and a large multi-purpose space that could be configured for different events. There were probably 150 people there, including most of the Vista Ridge residents and several local officials. Susan gave a speech about resilience in community, acknowledging the difficult period they'd gone through and thanking everyone who'd worked to make the new center a reality. Then, to my surprise, she called me up to the podium. "I want to recognize Ryan Isaacs," she said, gesturing for me to join her. Ryan inherited a complicated situation and handled it with integrity. He insisted on fair terms, but he also worked with us to find solutions. When our former HOA president committed a terrible crime and tried to blame him, he cooperated fully with law enforcement. And when we needed to rebuild, he worked with our insurance companies and contractors to make sure this center would be even better than what we lost. This community is stronger because of his leadership, and we're grateful for his continued partnership. People applauded, and I saw several faces in the crowd that had been hostile toward me 3 years earlier now, smiling genuinely. I said a few words about being proud of what the community had accomplished and looking forward to continuing our positive relationship. It wasn't a long speech, but it felt important. Afterward, several residents came up to shake my hand or thank me for being reasonable. Robert and Margaret Chen were there, and Margaret gave me a hug. "We're so glad you decided to stay," she said. "This place needs good people who care about the land and the community." Even some of the people who'd initially opposed the rent increase seemed to have made peace with it. A man named Gary Phillips, who'd been one of Pamela's most vocal supporters, approached me somewhat awkwardly. "Look, Ryan, I owe you an apology. I got caught up in all the anger and didn't think clearly about the situation. You were right to bring the rent in line with market rates, and you've been a good landowner. I'm sorry for some of the things I said about you back then." "I appreciate that, Gary. No hard feelings." The evening ended with a barbecue and live music. Elena and I stayed for a few hours, mingling with residents and enjoying the celebration. As we drove back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Elena squeezed my hand. "You handled that well. It can't have been easy going back there after everything that happened." "It was easier than I expected," I admitted. "I think everyone needed closure, including me. That community center represented so much conflict and pain. Seeing it rebuilt and full of happy people felt like turning a page. Does this mean you're finally done with the whole HOA saga?" "I hope so. I never wanted to be at war with my tenants. I just wanted to be a responsible landowner." "Well, you succeeded. Even the people who opposed you at first can see that now." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. The ranch prospered, my relationship with Elena deepened, and Vista Ridge Estates became just another aspect of property management, rather than a source of constant stress. I paid my property taxes on time, maintained the land responsibly, and collected ground rent without drama. It was exactly what I'd wanted from the beginning. Pamela Richardson was released from prison after serving 4.5 years of her 6-year sentence. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to Arizona to live with her sister and wanted nothing more to do with Texas or HOAs. Todd Hendricks got out a bit earlier and apparently moved back to Ohio where he'd grown up. Neither of them returned to Vista Ridge, which was probably best for everyone. The legal framework I'd established with the ground lease became something of a model for other similar situations in Texas. Martin used it as a template for other clients dealing with ground rent issues, and several property rights organizations cited it in their educational materials. I even got a call from a law professor at the University of Texas who wanted to use the Vista Ridge case in his property law class as an example of how lease agreements work in practice. "Your case touched on adverse possession, unconscionability, arson, and HOA governance," he explained. "It's like a greatest hits compilation of property law issues." "I'm glad someone got educational value out of it," I said. "Living through it was more stressful than enlightening, I'm sure. But you handled it correctly at every step, which is why it makes such a good teaching case. You followed the law, documented everything, and didn't let emotional pressure push you into bad decisions." Looking back on the whole experience 5 years later, I could see how much I'd grown. When I first inherited the ranch, I was a civil engineer from Seattle who didn't know the first thing about land management or dealing with tenants. I'd been thrust into a situation that would have been challenging for anyone, let alone someone with no experience. I made mistakes along the way, probably could have communicated better at times, but I'd also stood firm when it mattered and let the law work as it was designed to work. The ranch was thriving. The Vista Ridge relationship was stable and professional. I'd built a life in Texas that felt authentic and meaningful, and I'd learned that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that people will be angry with you, trusting that fairness will eventually win out over emotional manipulation. On a beautiful spring morning 5 years after inheriting the property, I was riding along the ridge trail when I spotted a small herd of white-tailed deer grazing in a meadow below. I stopped to watch them, thinking about how this view would never get old. 1,300 acres of Texas hill country, full of wildlife and possibility, maintained through sustainable practices and supported by fair business relationships. My inbox buzzed with a text from Susan Martinez at Vista Ridge. "Quarterly meeting next Thursday, 7 p.m. Agenda, pool maintenance and landscaping contracts. See you there?" I texted back a confirmation and continued my ride. Just another meeting, another normal interaction with the community that sat on my land. No drama, no conflict, just the routine business of property management. That's exactly what it should have been from the beginning, and that's what it had finally become. Uncle Frederick had left me more than land and money. He'd left me an opportunity to build something lasting, to be part of a community, and to learn what it meant to be responsible for a place and the people connected to it. I never did raise the rent again beyond the modest annual increases I'd promised. $250 a month remained below market rate as property values in the area continued to climb, but it provided enough income to sustain the ranch while keeping housing costs in Vista Ridge reasonable. It was a balance that worked for everyone, which was all I'd ever wanted. As the sun climbed higher and the morning warmed, I turned my horse toward home. There were cattle to check, fences to inspect, and a dozen other tasks waiting. But first, maybe I'd stop by the house and have coffee with Elena, who was probably already there, checking on one of the horses she'd been treating. Life was good, the land was healthy, the conflicts were behind me. And somewhere in Texas, probably several somewheres, other landowners were facing their own HOA battles, their own Pamela Richardsons, their own difficult decisions about fairness and business, and standing firm against unreasonable pressure. I hoped they'd handle it as well as I eventually had. I hoped they'd have good lawyers and supportive partners, and the patience to let things work out properly. Most of all, I hoped they'd remember that doing the right thing it isn't always the popular thing, but it's still worth doing. Even when people call you names, file lawsuits, and literally try to burn down buildings to frame you for crimes you didn't commit. Even when the whole world seems aligned against you, fairness matters. The law matters, truth matters, and eventually, if you hold steady and trust the process, people come around. Communities heal, relationships mend, justice prevails. At least, that's how it worked for me on 1,300 acres of hill country land, where a ground rent increase of $200 a month taught me more about human nature, business ethics, and community dynamics than I'd learned in 32 years of life before that. The Vista Ridge Estate's ground lease would outlast me by decades, probably by a century or more. Long after I was gone, other landowners and other residents would navigate that relationship, hopefully learning from what worked and what didn't during those tumultuous first few years. The ranch would continue, the community would evolve, and life in the Texas Hill Country would go on, but for now, on this particular spring morning, I was just a guy on a horse, riding across land that felt like home, grateful for the hard lessons that had brought me here, and the peaceful present they'd made possible. The HOA wars were over, the rent was fair, and everyone, finally, could just get on with their lives. That was victory enough for anyone.